Hello and welcome. In my video today, I have some simply designed Valentine's Day cards that feature some small elements and some simple colors in a gatefold design. For my first card, I am going to die cut this profile dog head out that will form one side of my card, and I'm just doing that out of black cardstock. Then I'm going to measure where I want the gatefold to overlap. So I want this element to overlap the gatefold, but still be a continuous card. So I'm going to be doing some partial die cutting. So I'm doing some math here to establish what length I need to cut my card, and that's going to be 9 3/4 by 5.5. So I will use my paper trimmer to trim down an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper to be 5.5 by 9 3/4. And I just figured out how much longer the die was than a 4 1/4 panel, and that's how I kind of figured out what the length should be. And then to partially die cut this, I'm going to line up the dog's head on the left-hand side so that the nose is kind of touching that edge and the bottom is hanging off. And then I've drawn this line in order to help me line up the die cutting plate so that I know where to place it, since there's a little bit of a curve in this. I'll run that through my die cutting machine and then remove the die from the card. And then I'm going to trim off with my paper trimmer right up to the edge of the dog's head there. And then I'm using my score tool to score at basically 2 1/8 on each side, so that it ends up being a 4 1/4 panel in the width, but you kind of have to eyeball it a little bit because it isn't quite exactly right with the measurements, depending on how the die cut head came out. For my backgrounds, I am ink blending over this paw print heart stencil with 3 shades of ink. I'm just creating a gradient from the bottom right to the top left. I also want this pattern to exist behind the dog's head so that when you open it up, it appears in sort of that blank space. It's not just blank. So I'm adding a piece of masking paper here to protect the inside of the card. And then I'm going to close that left side panel back down, realign my stencil, and then fill in that space behind the dog's head with the ink, keeping with that gradient pattern that I'm tried to create. And I am going to add my sentiment now, which says best friends forever, and it's just going to be nestled in right underneath where the dog's head eventually will go. I'm gluing the head down and then trimming off any of the excess cardstock from the bottom. And this die set that comes with this dog heads also includes a little bandana. So I'm cutting that out of this pattern paper and ink blending over it to help it match some of the colorations a little bit better, and gluing that to the dog. And I added some glossy accents to the nose, but here is the finished card. And when you open it up, that pattern exists behind the dog's head, and you can see that there's a continuous card with no like weird hanging off of the die elements. I'm going to repeat this for another card. In this one, I'm going to be using this panda head that I have stamped, colored, and die cut. I'm now going to measure it, and so it's a little bit bigger than the dog head. So I will be cutting out a 10-inch panel by 5.5 using my paper trimmer. And using the die, I'm lining it up on the edge of that left-hand side again and setting it up for some partial die cutting, where I'm just cutting off everything to the left and leaving that one line. I'll go ahead and remove the die after running it through my die cutting machine, and I'm going to draw a line to help me line it up in my paper trimmer. So I'm going to end up cutting one side, then flipping it around, and then cutting the other side, just going up right where the edge of that die cutting edge had ended. And then again, my math fails me, but I am basically creating a 4 1/4 width panel and just doing my best to make sure that fits into a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch envelope. Again, it doesn't quite end up being perfect, but it ends up working. For the background on this card, I am using this heart turnabout stamp. So to set this up, I am lining it up with that guide, and then lining the guide up with the X in this jig, which you can't really see. And I want this to exist like it's coming out right behind the head of the panda. So I'm lining up the X of the guide right to that panel. And then I am using sort of the X in the pattern to line up with the jig. Similar how I did before, but in this case I have the card base right behind. And so you can kind of see that it's sort of like off to the side and up at the top. But it's perfectly surrounding the panda's head. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp that. And much like the stencil, I want this to exist on the inside as well, right behind the panda head. Although it doesn't end up quite working as well just because of the repeated stamping. It kind of gets messed up, but that was the goal. So I'm just stamping it a second time. And then I'm going to turn the jig like I would normally, and you can see that the card base is now hanging off the edge there. So the pattern will be perfectly centered where I wanted it rather than centered to the card panel. And finishing the last color here, and I'm adding a sentiment that says I like you very much, just sort of tucked next to the little panda that I have glued down. And here is the finished panel. I have added some glossy accents to the nose, although you cannot see it at all in this video, but you can see that it's sort of the continuous edge on the right hand side, and the pattern does exist. It just has that little hole that was like part of the pattern. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you like these little cards, and happy Valentine's Day.